The story of modern policing in the United States begins long before today's headlines, rooted in systems designed to control and surveil Black bodies. In the early 1700s, slave patrols in the southern states were created to track, capture, and punish enslaved Africans using force and intimidation to maintain a racial hierarchy. After the Civil War, these patrols evolved into enforcement mechanisms for Black codes and later Jim Crow laws, where police played a central role in restricting the rights and freedoms of newly freed Black Americans. As policing expanded into northern cities during the Great Migration, Black communities continued to face disproportionate surveillance and criminalization. Patterns that carried into the modern era through policies like the war on drugs and stop and frisk. Today, Today, many researchers argue these practices have transformed into what's known as racialized proactive policing, contributing to strained relationships between law enforcement and Black communities. To understand how this history continues to shape present day experiences, I spoke with three Howard University students who shared their perspectives on policing and the personal ways it has impacted their lives and the lives of their families.
God forbid, but if I was to get into some type of altercation, whether it's verbally or God forbid physically with a white person, and it's like I'm being made to seem like the aggressor, like you know how Karens are. Like if I was to ever come across a Karen and they're trying to frame me for something that I know I didn't do, then I would be nervous because with the police, it's a white woman and a black man. Like we all know whose side they're going to take. I mean, we're in DC, so you got to keep your head on the swivel. But with the presence of the National Guard and like all the police around, it's just I have to be extra careful and more mindful of, you know, when I'm walking back to my apartment, making sure it's not too late. If I am walking back too late, then making sure I come off in a way that's not too intimidating, like not having my hood on, leaving one AirPod out, like just so I can be aware of my surroundings at all times because they're actively patrolling and I feel like they're just looking for a reason to do something.
We talk about policing a lot. It's just something that is part of the Black experience. I think that I could pretty much walk up to any person on this campus who is an African American individual, and they would have something to say about police brutality, their own experiences with police brutality, their family's experiences with police brutality. I don't want to say it's part of the Black culture, but it is something that is very close to being a collective experience for African American individuals. I think that it would be very rare to find an individual within the Black community who hasn't heard of at least a negative experience that happened between police and Black people. I would not call the police to prevent a conflict from occurring, and I would not call the police to deal with a ongoing conflict. Um, I have my own personal problems with police. There are a bunch of lawsuits that say police don't even have to prevent crimes. So if you're going to call the police, the only time you call the police is after something happens. So then, sure, I'll consider calling the police, but I'm not going to have the police come and try to do conflict management, or even if I feel my safety is threatened, um, I don't see a point in calling the police because there's no guarantee that the police are even going to do anything.
There was this one time where my mom, she got pulled over. My little sister was in the car, right? And the officer was very aggressive. He was like very stern, direct, just very. You could tell that his presence, he wasn't being, he probably wasn't being genuine. But he pulled up and he said, "Hey, I did your car doesn't have insurance on it. Y'all need to, show me, license registration, show me that, prove that you have insurance, right?" And my mom, she didn't have the information on her at the time, so she had to call my dad because my dad had all that information, right? And the cop was just being really impatient. He just did not care or really have any like empathy for the situation. He was getting ready to call the tow truck and leave my mom and my little sister on the side of the road. And by the time like my dad got it, he was like already like trying to like actively like get a hold of like someone to go take the car. And fortunately, my dad was able to get that information in time. And when my mom said, here's here it is, here's my insurance, we have it, we're good. The officer, he went up to the window and he was, all right, well, have a good day, man. Walked off, just snarky, just bullshit, you know. I know how my mom felt in that situation. She told me that she was like embarrassed. She was, I want to say if shame is the word for it, but she was definitely angry and definitely embarrassed by the entire situation. Especially since there was just no reason, there was no reason for him to pull her over in the first place. She wasn't breaking any laws. She wasn't speeding. She didn't run any red lights, you know, and I honestly think it was just racial profiling. I don't see any other reason he would pull her over for.
Retired police officer Dennis Hill acknowledges the factors that can lead to breakdowns between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
You have to understand that too. So specifically to bias, bias comes from what they think or what we think we've been exposed to as opposed to what's truly going on. And if I truly understood that the person who's not cooperating is not cooperating because they may have some sort of developmental challenge, they may be under the influence, all these other factors as opposed to just rushing in because, well, the last person I encountered, he was physically violent. So therefore, this person is going to become physically violent. That's a preconceived bias going in because each situation is different. I should not hold you to a standard as the last encounter because I don't know what the encounter with you is going to look like until we get there. Um, and then also understanding people, getting to know human beings, as that we all want the same thing. We all want to be treated with decency and kindness and we all want to be valued and respected. And I think a lot of times police officers can get caught up in the notion that I'm the person in charge, that I have to win. Sometimes a win doesn't necessarily mean the outcome that you expected. Sometimes a win means that we're able to walk away with our dignity intact, without having had a physical confrontation. At the end of the day, you may not like the outcome because you're going to get the ticket or you're going to go to jail. But I've arrested 1,000 people, and I can tell you unequivocally, I don't have not one single concern about walking down the street and encountering someone I've arrested because I always treated people with dignity and respect. I've had people come out of jail and dap me up on the streets and say, hey, and my family like, well, who was that? Somebody arrested. Why is he so friendly? Why was he so kind? Because that's how I treat people. If we treat people with kindness, even in the most turbulent times, even when a serious action has to take place, a serious consequence has to take place, you treat them with decency. They're going to respect the fact that, hey, you know what? I'm going to have a consequence, but I was treated like a human being throughout the encounter. And that's what we're hoping for. That should be the goal for everyone who puts on uniform and has interactions with people.
According to Maisha Watkins, an administrator at the Cuyahoga County Office of Violence Prevention, broader systematic structures contribute to over-policing in certain neighborhoods.
Oftentimes, over-policing is done in communities that are systemically, generationally impacted by poverty. And unfortunately, a lot of those communities see law enforcement as a trigger. I think the underinvestment or the lack of investment, underemployment or lack of employment allow crimes to be high in those communities as typically people thought process haven't lived in communities like that is typically by any means necessary. And I don't think it's because they want to choose to be a criminal or they want to be violent, but being a part of a underground economy that fuels a lifestyle to get their basic needs met. And so law enforcement is aware of those challenges and crimes that are happening. But I think through investment, systemic change that, like surrounding communities and safe suburbia, we can model some of the practices that already exist. I think there are so many examples, so many models that have been created. Even if you think about the Black Panther movement, like they were founded to address the systemic and communal issues that impacted communities of poverty. And what that meant is just being intentional about getting the resources to those who did not have. And even if you think about surrounding communities that have grocery stores, a successful and engaged school system, quality housing, out of school time programming, like all of these things that have already been created, if intentionally place based in communities where over policing typically is, you'll understand that we can program our way out of poverty more than we can police our way out of it. I do think that there is a balance of those who are causing harm in communities that are impacted by violence where policing has to happen for law and order. However, if the solutions are investment, I think that we should lean more towards investment than incarceration as the default response to policing.
Professor Aisha Bell Hardaway of Case Western Reserve University, whose research focuses on policing and the intersection of race and the law, also highlights the judicial barriers that hinder reform.
Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has done a terrible job of creating a space and an opportunity for there to be meaningful oversight of police and for communities to use their standards in enforcing and dictating how officers should be disciplined and what misconduct remedies should look like, right? There are a couple of U.S. Supreme Court cases, one out of Philadelphia and another one out of California. Lyons is the one, U.S. versus Lyons is the one out of California, where decades ago there was a gentleman who was choked by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, I want to say, and him and his lawyer did a phenomenal job of gathering data around the number of times that Black males specifically were either being severely disabled or killed because of chokeholds. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that that person didn't have the authority or the standing, right, to ask for a remedy that required the L.A. sheriffs to remove chokeholds from their policy manuals. Thurgood Marshall writes a stellar dissent in that case, because if you read the majority opinion, you have no idea of how much it's based on myth and fallacy, quite honestly, how much the U.S. Supreme Court is really absconding their responsibility in that case. There's another case out of Philadelphia. It's Rizzo versus Good, and it's which turns into the Copar case. And there was a group of community members in the city of Philadelphia who were tracking misconduct and doing everything they could to make sure that problem officers were known by both the community and the cities, so that the issue could be addressed. A federal judge said, this is good, we'll work through this, ordered the police department to institute a set of reforms, and the U.S. Supreme Court said you don't have the authority to ask them to do that. Right, so there are judicial barriers to reform.
Ultimately, meaningful police reform will require a combination of accountability, transparency, and structural change that addresses both individual misconduct and the broader systems that allow disparities to persist. Policy proposals such as eliminating qualified immunity, strengthening national training standards, and restructuring how police misconduct settlements are funded all aim to shift incentives towards greater responsibility and public trust. At the same time, long-term reforms focused on officer wellness, community-based policing, and changes to police culture highlight the need to rethink how safety is defined and delivered in American communities. While there is no single solution, there is a growing agreement that incremental adjustments alone are not enough to address deeply rooted inequities in the system. This is Madison Maynard reporting from Washington, D.C.